He built this restaurant with his bare hands. Tonight, they wouldn't even let him through the door. One look at his hoodie, and she decided he didn't belong. She had no idea who she was turning away. Daughter's birthday dinner, his own restaurant, and still flung. The doors stayed shut. He said nothing. He swallowed it whole. But by morning, the entire staff would know exactly who he was. Tomorrow, he wouldn't walk in as a stranger. Tomorrow, he'd walk in as the man whose name was on the deed.
Marcus Bennett had exactly 11 minutes to make it to his daughter's birthday dinner, and he was going to be late. He wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better decades, locked the door of the small auto shop he moonlighted at on weekends, not because he needed the money, though most people who knew him thought he did, and jogged the 4 blocks toward the restaurant. If you had stopped him on the street and asked what he did for a living, he would have told you he worked in food service, which was true in the same way that saying the ocean was a bit of water was true. Marcus Bennett owned the Hallowed Spoon, one of the city's most talked about restaurants, the kind of place written up in glossy magazines with words like elevated and transcendent splashed across the page. Nobody at the restaurant knew what he looked like. That had been the plan from the very beginning, and for 9 years, it had worked exactly as he wanted it to. When Marcus opened the Hallowed Spoon, he was 29 years old, freshly out of a marriage that had left him with a daughter, a mountain of debt, and a stubborn belief that a restaurant could be more than a place people paid to feel important. He had grown up the son of a diner cook in a town where nobody had money to spare, and he remembered exactly what it felt like to be looked at like you didn't belong somewhere. The flicker of a hostess's eyes taking in your shoes, your coat, the way your family counted out cash instead of sliding over a card. He swore that if he ever built something of his own, it would never make anyone feel small. So when the restaurant became successful, wildly, unexpectedly successful, Marcus made an unusual choice. He hired a general manager to run daily operations, stayed almost entirely behind the scenes, communicated through his lawyer and a shell company called Founders Table Holdings, and kept a single rule etched into the original lease agreement. There would always be one table, the Founders Table, held for anyone who needed a warm meal and couldn't necessarily afford the menu price. No questions asked. It was his quiet act of defiance against every maitre d' who had ever looked down a nose at his family. For years, that rule was sacred. The restaurant thrived. The Founders Table quietly fed struggling families, laid-off workers, a homeless veteran named Curtis who came in every other Sunday, and nobody outside a small circle knew that the scruffy man dropping off supply invoices twice a month was the actual owner. Then, 8 months ago, the general manager who had helped Marcus build that culture retired, and in his place came Richard Voss, a polished, ambitious man with an impressive resume and a philosophy that could be summed up in one sentence he liked to repeat at staff meetings: perception is the product. Voss believed the Hallowed Spoon's reputation depended on an image of exclusivity, and within weeks of taking over, he quietly began enforcing an unwritten dress code, discouraging walk-ins who didn't fit the brand. And, without ever telling Marcus, who rarely visited in person and trusted his team completely, he canceled the Founders Table. Marcus had no idea any of this was happening. He was busy being a father. His daughter Mia had just turned 9, and she had been begging for weeks to celebrate her birthday at Daddy's favorite restaurant, a place he had taken her to only once before, quietly, seated by an old hostess who happened to recognize him. Mia adored the story he told her about the restaurant with the golden lights and the little chocolate souffle that came out with a candle in it. She had no idea, of course, that her father owned the place. He liked it that way. He wanted her to grow up believing that good things happened to people because the world was kind, not because her last name opened doors. So on a Friday evening in early autumn, after a long week of quietly covering a mechanic friend's rent so his family wouldn't lose their apartment, Marcus picked Mia up from her mother's house in his work clothes, a gray hoodie, jeans, sneakers with a small hole starting at the toe, and drove straight to the Hallowed Spoon without stopping to change, because Mia had been counting down the hours and he refused to make her wait 1 minute longer than necessary. They walked in together, Mia's hand in his, her yellow dress peeking out from under her denim jacket, a small backpack with a cat keychain bouncing against her back. The lobby smelled the way it always did, rosemary and warm bread, and the faint sweetness of caramelizing sugar drifting from the kitchen, and for a moment Marcus felt that old, familiar pride settle into his chest. Then a young hostess named Priya, new to the job and thoroughly trained by Richard Voss's new standards, looked up from her podium, took in the hoodie, the jeans, the worn sneakers, and the child clutching a backpack instead of a designer purse, and her professional smile tightened into something colder. "I'm sorry," she said, glancing past them as though searching for a more appropriate guest. "We're fully booked for private reservations this evening." Marcus blinked. The restaurant, visible behind her, was barely a third full. "I don't have a reservation," he said evenly, "but I was hoping we could grab a table. It's my daughter's birthday." Priya's eyes flicked toward the dining room, toward a group in tailored blazers being seated by the window, and back to Marcus's hoodie. "I really am sorry, sir. Tonight's a member's preferred evening. Perhaps somewhere more casual down the street would suit you both better." The word casual landed like a slap, though her tone stayed sugar-sweet the entire time. Marcus felt his ears go hot, that specific humiliating heat that comes from being dismissed in front of your own child. He glanced down at Mia. Her smile, the wide, gap-toothed smile she'd worn the entire car ride, the smile of a 9-year-old who had been promised something wonderful, was folding in on itself, confusion clouding her eyes as she looked between her father and the hostess who clearly did not want them there. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging his sleeve, "is this the wrong place?" And there it was, the moment that would replay in Marcus's mind for the rest of the night. Not the insult to himself. He could absorb that. He'd absorbed worse his whole life. It was the sight of his daughter's joy curdling into embarrassment, the way she instinctively lowered her voice as if she too had done something wrong simply by being there. He could have said something. He could have reached into his jacket, pulled out his ID, called Voss down to the lobby, and watched Priya's face drain of color as she realized exactly whose restaurant she'd just turned away. Every instinct told him to. But Mia was watching him, and Marcus had promised himself years ago that his daughter would never see him weaponize power to win an argument, that she would learn dignity by watching him hold on to his even when it was hardest. So instead he knelt down, zipped her jacket a little higher against the cool evening air, and said quietly, "You're right, sweetheart. Let's find somewhere even better." He forced his voice to stay light. He forced his hands to stay steady, and he walked his daughter 2 blocks over to a 24-hour diner with sticky vinyl booths and a jukebox that only half worked, where a tired waitress named Donna brought Mia a slice of cherry pie with a candle stuck haphazardly in the whipped cream, and the entire kitchen staff sang an off-key happy birthday. Mia laughed so hard milkshake nearly came out of her nose, and for a few hours, Marcus let himself believe the night had been saved. But once Mia was asleep that night, curled up in her bed with the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 2, Marcus sat alone in his home office with a laptop glowing in the dark and a knot in his stomach that refused to loosen. He pulled up the restaurant's reservation system, then the internal messaging logs he rarely bothered to check, then, finally, 8 months of security footage he had never once reviewed because he trusted his team completely. What he found made his hands go cold. Priya hadn't been acting alone or out of personal cruelty. She'd been following an actual policy. There it was, buried in an internal memo from Richard Voss, dated 7 months earlier. Effective immediately. Front-of-house staff should use discretion when seating walk-in guests during peak service. Prioritize parties who reflect our brand image. The Founders Table program is suspended until further notice. It does not serve our positioning goals. Marcus read it 3 times. Then he opened the footage archive and watched, one clip after another. Families turned away. An elderly man in a threadbare coat asked to wait outside, for the patio which isn't open. A young mother with 2 kids quietly told the restaurant was not really set up for children. This evening, while, 20 feet away, a table of well-dressed guests laughed over champagne. Curtis, the veteran who used to eat quietly at the Founders Table every other Sunday, hadn't been seen on any footage in months. Marcus felt something in his chest crack open. Not just anger, but grief for the exact thing he'd built the restaurant to protect. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he called his lawyer, a sharp, steady woman named Diane, who had drafted the original Founders Table Holdings paperwork 9 years earlier and still handled the account. "I need every ownership document ready by tomorrow morning," he told her. "And I need to know exactly what I'm legally allowed to walk in and say." He also called Elena Cruz, the restaurant's sous chef, one of only 3 employees who had worked there since opening night, and who still, occasionally, texted Marcus directly to check in. Not because she knew he was the owner in name, but because Marcus had quietly helped her years earlier, back when she was a 19-year-old line cook working double shifts to support her mother, and he'd made sure her schedule never conflicted with her community college classes. Elena was 24 now, steady-handed and sharp-eyed, and when Marcus called her at 11 at night and asked, carefully, gently, whether anything had changed at the restaurant in the last several months, she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Honestly, it doesn't feel like the same place anymore." She told him about the new discretion policy, about watching Priya turn away a family last week and feeling sick about it, about quietly slipping bread and soup out the kitchen side door to a couple of regulars Voss had banned from the dining room. "I didn't know who else to tell," she admitted. "I didn't think anyone with real power actually cared." The next morning, Marcus put on a charcoal suit he hadn't worn in over a year, the only formal clothing he owned, and drove back to the Hallowed Spoon with a folder of documents under his arm. Mia was at school. This was not something she needed to witness. He walked through the front doors at 11:40, 20 minutes before the lunch shift began, when the dining room was empty except for staff setting tables and Richard Voss reviewing a clipboard near the bar. A different hostess, not Priya, looked up and seeing the suit, immediately smiled the practiced smile reserved for important guests. "Welcome to the Hallowed Spoon, sir. Do you have a reservation?" Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The same building, the same doors, an entirely different reception, all because of what he was wearing. "No reservation," he said. "But I do own the place. I'd like to speak with Richard Voss and the full front-of-house team, please. Now, if possible." What followed was the kind of scene that restaurant staff would talk about for years. Voss strode over, already annoyed at the interruption, opened his mouth to explain that walk-in meetings weren't how things worked here, and stopped cold when Diane, waiting by the door, stepped forward and calmly introduced Marcus by his full legal name as the sole owner of Founders Table Holdings LLC, parent company of the Hallowed Spoon. Marcus watched the color drain from Voss's face in real time. He watched Priya, who had come in early for her shift and was refilling salt shakers nearby, freeze mid-motion, a small gasp escaping her as recognition dawned. The hoodie, the jeans, the daughter with the yellow dress. Marcus asked the entire staff to gather in the dining room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He told them the story of why he'd built the restaurant in the first place, about growing up watching his father get treated like an afterthought in his own hometown, about promising himself that nobody would ever walk through these doors and be measured by their shoes. He told them about the Founders Table, about Curtis, about the memo Voss had written suspending it. He told them quietly that last night he had stood at that very podium with his 9-year-old daughter on her birthday and been turned away by his own restaurant. Several staff members lowered their eyes. Priya's hands were shaking. "I'm not telling you this to humiliate anyone," Marcus said. "I'm telling you because somewhere along the way, this place forgot what it was built for, and that's on me too for not paying closer attention, but it stops today." He turned to Voss and calmly, without theatrics, informed him that his employment was terminated effective immediately, not for the policy alone, but for building an entire culture in secret that directly contradicted everything Marcus had put in writing when he founded the company, and for never once raising it with him, choosing instead to quietly override it. Voss left without a word, his face a tight mask of humiliation he had, ironically, spent months inflicting on strangers. To the rest of the staff, Marcus offered something different, a choice. Anyone who had followed Voss's policy out of fear of losing their job, who wanted to help rebuild what the restaurant used to be, was welcome to stay, retrained, and given a raise funded by cutting the brand consulting budget Voss had spent lavishly on. Priya, tearful, asked to speak with him privately afterward, apologizing not just for the previous night but for a dozen small moments she now realized she'd let slide because it was easier than pushing back on her manager. Marcus, who remembered what it felt like to be 22 and afraid of losing a job he needed, told her that mistakes made out of fear could be repaired by choices made out of courage, and gave her the chance to prove it. Elena, who had quietly kept the spirit of the founder's table alive in secret for months at real risk to her own position, was promoted on the spot to head chef, the youngest in the restaurant's history, with Marcus telling her plainly, "You protected what I couldn't see. That's worth more than any title I could have given you." That Sunday, Marcus brought Mia back to the hallowed spoon, properly this time, though he still wore the same gray hoodie, because some things didn't need to change. Priya greeted them personally at the podium, kneeling to Mia's eye level to apologize for the birthday she'd nearly ruined, and led them not to a random table but to the newly restored founder's table by the window, its little brass plaque polished for the first time in months. Curtis was there too, invited back with a handwritten note and, this time, a standing weekly reservation. Mia got her chocolate souffle with a candle, and the entire kitchen staff, led by Elena, came out to sing, off-key and delighted, while Marcus watched his daughter's face light up exactly the way it was supposed to. Later that night, tucking Mia into bed, she asked him sleepily why the restaurant felt so different now. Marcus thought about how to explain 9 years of building something, and one night of nearly losing it, in a way a 9-year-old could understand. "Some people forget that everyone deserves a seat at the table," he said finally, smoothing her hair back. "Sometimes you have to remind them, quietly if you can, loudly if you have to." Mia considered this with the serious solemnity only children can manage. "Even people in hoodies?" she asked. Marcus smiled in the dark. "Especially people in hoodies." The restaurant went on to thrive, busier, warmer, and more full than it had ever been under Voss's polished, exclusive image, because it turned out that what people actually wanted, the whole time, wasn't a velvet rope. It was a seat that had already been saved for them.